This is a download from BFM 89.9, the business station.
Good morning, George. So it's been a very, very turbulent week. US earnings, what have been the highlights for you thus far, and which has had the biggest impact on market overall?
Good morning, Nadia. Well, obviously the dramatic decline in energy has had quite a significant push to the downside for the commodity, but perhaps it will help the consumer over here longer term. So as production was relatively strong, but demand is absolutely weak. And we're going to be watching to see if that turns around. We don't expect it for a while. There was a dramatic decline in consumer discretionary, which was something that's not as easily explained, and it has something to do with the U.S. consumer, and it's not good. There has been very consistently strong earnings in healthcare, and there's been a rebound for the banks. So those are the four sectors that we've been watching, both on the upside and the downside. Overall, earnings have been slightly inferior to the second quarter, not strong enough to push the market up to major new highs, but certainly enough to keep the market positive, particularly as we are still within the low interest rate environment. We're really seeing much shorter-term volatility in response to the news. The three moves that you typically get when the news of earnings comes out have been much shorter in nature and much more volatile. There's been a stronger counter reaction within the first 10 minutes, and then after that there is more of a trend. But the trend is not necessarily explainable by the news that comes out. You really have to watch the projected revenue growth much more than earnings. That seems to be what's driving the market going forward.
Retail, however, not been performing. Sears have announced that it is closing stores ahead of the Christmas shopping season, which is fairly strange. And investors have taken Amazon's steeper than usual losses a bit negatively. So what's your view on this? You were mentioning discretionary spending.
Yes, Nadia, we're not as optimistic for retail as a sector as a whole for the upcoming holiday. Shield has actually had a good day on Friday and got back above the levels of investor support, but there's really not going to be much more of a move to the upside. We're seeing more opportunities on the short side, obviously Amazon on the rallies, Deckers Outdoor, Tesla Motors on breakdowns, and Williams-Sonoma over here. There are fewer on the upside. We have Denny's Restaurant, which is going to be reporting tomorrow after the close. Yeah, Starbucks on Thursday. And Friday, actually, we're going to be watching Chevron and Exxon not only for the absolute performance of those two stocks, but also the implications that it has on the consumer and the cost of getting to the store. So it's a much more circumspect outlook for the sector going into this holiday season. The sector as a whole is going to have to prove itself, both on the top side like Tiffany's and also on the lower cost like Walmart.
Overall, though, what has your feeling been on the earnings season report card? Yes, no, bad, good?
The feeling is maybe. We're still in a market that's being valued based on low interest rates, and now it looks like that environment is going to stay. So we don't think that the earnings this quarter are going to have as much of an impact on the market activity, the market direction, as they would under ordinary circumstances. I am hopeful that we're seeing enough stability across the board in the earnings to warrant some real confidence as we go into the first quarter of next year. This is not a market commentary. This is just pure economic valuations because, again, our markets are still being valued at low interest rates.
The UK's improving economy hit a slight speed bump when its GDP for the third quarter slowed. However, do you think this is just seasonal?
Well, they're doing pretty well. In absolute terms, they're one of the best economies in the world right now. But looking at their progress, their domestic product decreased. Well, it increased to only by 0.7% versus the prior 3 months, which was 9.9%. So yes, there is some slowing down. Recent economic indicators have pointed to a weakening UK housing market, slower manufacturing and consumer spending, which is something we're beginning to see over here. Consumer demand for British goods abroad has also dropped, lowering UK's competitiveness. It's also export orders for the first time in 18 months. Overall, though, the UK continues to lead the pack in an increasingly uncertain global economy. But this is showing that the UK is not immune to weakness in the euro area and instability in global markets. So for it to be nothing more than just a blip or a quarter blip, the UK economy has to prove itself over the next 2 quarters.
It's funny you say that it's one of the best performing economies in the world. Because of that, the EU actually demanded an extra £1.7 billion towards the EU budget from the UK, which, of course, Prime Minister David Cameron called appalling. So what's your take?
Well, superficially, it does appear outrageous that the UK is having to make up for the bad actors within the EU. But the reason behind this demand is because the UK's past estimate of gross national income, a GNI they call it, had been too little for over a decade, going back to 2002. Having finally reached an agreement with Eurostat, the European Statistical Agency, on how to measure its economy properly, Britain now finds itself richer than it thought. While the total amount is 2.1 billion euros, and that's a huge amount, and it's really, in relative terms, it amounts to about 0.01% of its GNI for that decade. In addition to Britain, there are several others, the Netherlands, Italy, Cyprus, and Greece, that are also making payments, obviously not as much in absolute terms. And then there are the winners, like France, Germany, Poland, and Finland. Obviously, the timing is not good for Cameron. But the news there doesn't seem to be any bias as to the timing of the news. It just seems to be part of the routine process of their country-by-country revisions. Can Britain and the Netherlands do anything to stop the surcharges? Probably not. The mechanism for calculating it is not open to negotiation. It was agreed upon and based on a long-standing principle. But Cameron might try to convince a blocking minority of countries to hold up the entire annual budget. He then might be able to require some concessions and revisions. If the Commission is just applying law, perhaps there may be some creative thinking in how to address the surcharge issue. But overall, the UK is being penalized for better performance, and unfortunately, countries like France, which have not bitten the bullet yet, are going to be the benefits. So even though it makes sense in absolute terms, it is still, Cameron does have some realistic comment about having to make up for the bad actors.
That was Dodger Dolan, Chairman and Chief Investment Officer of Land Infused Capital Managers in New York.
Thank you for listening to this podcast. To find more great interviews, go to bfm.my or find us on iTunes. BFM 89.9, the business station.